This morning, we are turning the spotlight on the murder of Sade Robinson and how her alleged killer reportedly planned her death weeks in advance. Sade Robinson was last seen alive on a dinner date in Milwaukee with Maxwell Anderson, their first date, seen here in surveillance images from WITI TV. Cell phone records show that they ended up at Anderson's house, and then she was never heard from again. The next day, someone found a severed leg in a nearby park belonging to Robinson. Anderson is now accused of killing, dismembering, and leaving Sade's body parts all over Milwaukee. WISN television reports that a friend of Anderson's is now a confidential informant in the case. He told police that Anderson showed him a room in his basement where he planned to kill Sade. The search warrant indicated a plastic tarp covered a sanitation sink, and 3 saws were found in the room. The informant told police that Anderson planned on shooting Robinson and then dismembering her body in the room before disposing of her body throughout the city.
A 19-year-old college student puts on her favorite outfit and checks herself in the mirror one last time. She's excited about her first date with a guy she met at a bar the week before. She has no idea that in less than 12 hours she'll be dead. And her killer? He's already thinking about how to cut up her body and scatter the pieces across Milwaukee. This is the story of Sade Robinson, a bright student with her whole life ahead of her. She worked at Pizza Shuttle, went to Milwaukee Area Technical College, and lived in her own apartment. She was independent, smart, and trusting. Maybe too trusting. On April 1st, 2024, Sade thought she was going on a normal date. She met Maxwell Anderson at a restaurant, then a bar, then his apartment. By the next morning, Anderson was driving around Milwaukee in Sade's own car, dumping parts of her body in parks and near playgrounds where children play. Welcome to this channel. If cases like this keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Like this video, share it, and hit that subscribe button because we explore the darkest files every week. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. Anderson didn't just kill Sade. He had a plan, and that plan was so detailed, so twisted that even the judge called it something out of a horror movie. Sade Carlina Robinson was born in 2004 and grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At 19, she was doing what most young adults do, figuring out her life, working hard, and building her future. She was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, focused on her education and determined to make something of herself. Sade wasn't just another college student, though. She had a job at Pizza Shuttle, a local restaurant where she worked to support herself. She lived independently in her own apartment on Commerce Street, showing just how responsible and mature she was for her age. Her coworkers and friends described her as bright, loving, and full of ambition. Family meant everything to Sade. Her mother, Sheena Scarborough, and her father, Carlos Robinson, were incredibly close to their daughter. She also had a sister who looked up to her. The Robinson family was tight-knit, and Sade was the kind of daughter who stayed in touch, who came home for family dinners, who made her parents proud. Sade was the type of person who lit up a room when she walked in. She had dreams, goals, and people who loved her deeply. She was building a life that had so much promise. She deserved to see where that life would take her. In March 2024, Sade was out at a local Milwaukee bar, probably just enjoying a night out like any other 19-year-old would. That's where she met Maxwell Anderson. He was 34 years old, 15 years older than her. To Sade, he might have seemed mature, experienced, maybe even charming. But Maxwell Anderson was not the kind of man any parent would want their daughter to meet. Anderson had a criminal record that should have been a massive red flag. He had been arrested multiple times for domestic violence. He had disorderly conduct charges. He had problems with alcohol and had been caught driving drunk. This wasn't a guy who made one mistake. This was a pattern of violence and bad decisions that went back years. Anderson had even served in the U.S. Navy at some point, but whatever discipline or honor that service might have taught him was long gone. By the time he met Sade, he was just another guy with a history of hurting people, especially women. After that first meeting at the bar, Anderson and Sade stayed in contact. They texted back and forth over the next week. To Sade, this probably felt normal, getting to know someone new, maybe feeling excited about a potential relationship. She had no way of knowing what kind of person she was really talking to. Anderson, on the other hand, was already making plans. According to what came out later in court, he had told someone about a detailed plan for killing. He wasn't just thinking about hurting someone, he was actively planning it. When Anderson asked Sade out on a proper date, she said yes. She probably thought she was just going to have dinner and drinks with a guy she liked. She had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been set specifically for her. April 1st, 2024 started like any other Monday for Sade Robinson. She woke up in her apartment on Commerce Street, probably thinking about her classes, her work shift, and her date later that evening. She had no idea this would be the last normal morning of her life. Sade went to work at Pizza Shuttle that day, just like she always did. Her co-workers later said she seemed happy and excited about her plans for the evening. She was looking forward to seeing Maxwell Anderson again. She finished her shift around 5 in the afternoon, probably rushing home to get ready for what she thought would be a fun night out. At some point that afternoon, Sade and Anderson confirmed their plans through text messages. Cell phone records would later show exactly when they were communicating and where they both were throughout the day. Anderson was at his apartment on South 39th Street, waiting. Around 5 o'clock, Sade drove her Honda Civic to meet Anderson. Their first stop was the Twisted Fisherman, a seafood restaurant where Anderson had actually worked before. They arrived shortly after 5 and stayed until about 6:30. Security cameras captured them sitting together, eating dinner, having drinks. To anyone watching, they looked like a normal couple on a date. From the restaurant, they drove together in Sade's car to their second location, Duke's on Water, a bar in downtown Milwaukee. This is where things get really important for understanding what happened next. They stayed at Duke's until about 9 o'clock in the evening. Again, security cameras recorded their every move. They were drinking, talking, and Sade seemed comfortable and relaxed. But here's what's terrifying about this timeline. While Sade was enjoying what she thought was a nice evening out, Anderson was already thinking about what he was going to do to her. The prosecution would later argue that he had been planning this for days, maybe even weeks. At 9 o'clock, they left Duke's on Water. Sade drove them both back to Anderson's apartment at 3161 South 39th Street on Milwaukee's South Side. She parked her car outside his building. Security cameras in the area captured her Honda Civic arriving at his apartment complex. This is the moment everything changed for Sade Robinson. Cell phone records show that both of their phones were at Anderson's apartment from about 9:30 that evening. Sade's phone would send and receive a few more messages over the next few hours, but investigators later determined that Anderson was the one using her phone, not Sade herself. What happened inside that apartment would become the focus of one of Milwaukee's most disturbing murder trials. But we know from the evidence that came out in court that Sade became incapacitated at some point during the evening. Photos found on Anderson's phone showed him touching her inappropriately while she was lying face down on his couch, unable to move or defend herself. The last real activity on Sade's phone was around midnight. After that, there was nothing. No calls to friends, no texts to family, no social media posts. For a 19-year-old who was active on her phone every day, this silence was deafening. By the early morning hours of April 2nd, Anderson was already putting his plan into action. Security cameras would later show Sade's Honda Civic leaving his apartment complex around 6 in the morning. But Sade wasn't driving it anymore. She was already dead. And Anderson was behind the wheel, heading to dispose of her body. What Anderson did next shocked everyone and left Sade's family searching for answers that would take months to find. Inside Anderson's apartment that night, something terrible happened to Sade Robinson. Photos discovered on Anderson's phone showed Sade lying face down on his couch. She was unconscious and unable to defend herself. In these photos, Anderson was groping her while she lay there helpless. Her clothing had been removed and she was completely vulnerable. Prosecutors argued that Sade was incapacitated and could not resist what was happening to her. These photos were taken sometime during the evening of April 1st or the early morning hours of April 2nd. They show a young woman who trusted someone enough to go to his home, only to be violated when she was at her most defenseless. The photos were evidence of Anderson's mindset. He wasn't just planning to hurt Sade, he was documenting it. What happened next was even worse. Anderson killed Sade Robinson in his apartment. The prosecution never established exactly how he murdered her, but they proved beyond doubt that he was responsible for her death. The motive also remained unclear. Anderson never gave a coherent explanation for why he killed a 19-year-old college student who had done nothing wrong except trust him. After murdering Sade, Anderson began the most disturbing part of his plan. He dismembered her body inside his apartment. When police later searched his home, they found blood on the walls and a basement area that prosecutors described as being set up specifically for this purpose. The basement contained tarps and saws, tools that Anderson used to cut up Sade's body. But Anderson's plan didn't stop there. He had thought about how to dispose of the evidence, and he put that plan into action immediately. Using Sade's own Honda Civic, he loaded her remains into the car and began driving around Milwaukee County. He knew exactly where he was going and what he was going to do. Anderson drove to Warnemont Park near Lake Michigan. This is where he disposed of parts of Sade's body without being seen. The park was quiet in the early morning hours, and Anderson was able to carry out his plan without anyone noticing. He scattered her remains in different locations, making it harder for police to find all the evidence. After disposing of Sade's body parts, Anderson drove her car to an area behind an abandoned building. He set the Honda Civic on fire, hoping to destroy any DNA evidence or fingerprints that might connect him to the crime. The burning car was discovered later that morning, but by then, Anderson was already gone. Here's how cold and calculated Anderson really was. After burning Sade's car, he calmly walked to a bus stop and took public transportation back to his apartment. Security cameras captured him getting on the bus, acting like nothing had happened. He went home and tried to continue with his normal routine, but Anderson made one crucial mistake. He tried to cover up Sade's disappearance by sending text messages from her phone. He sent messages to make it look like Sade was still alive and had left his apartment safely. These fake messages were meant to throw off anyone who might come looking for her. The problem was that investigators quickly figured out these messages weren't really from Sade. The timing, the language, and the circumstances all pointed to someone else using her phone. This became one of the key pieces of evidence that led police directly to Anderson. What do you think was going through Anderson's mind during all of this? Was this something he had been planning for weeks, or did it happen in the moment? Let me know in the comments below. Anderson's behavior after the murder shows just how dangerous he really was. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of anger that got out of control. This was planned, methodical, and carried out with frightening precision. He had thought about every step, from the murder itself to the dismemberment, from disposing of the body to destroying evidence, from the fake text messages to his alibi. But despite all his planning, Anderson couldn't account for one thing: the determination of Sade's family to find her, and the skill of the investigators who would soon be on his trail. His perfect plan was about to fall apart, and the evidence he left behind would seal his fate. Maxwell Anderson thought he had committed the perfect crime. After murdering and dismembering Sade Robinson in his apartment, he spent the early morning hours of April 2nd carrying out what he believed was a foolproof plan to cover his tracks. Anderson loaded Sade's remains into her own Honda Civic and drove through Milwaukee in the darkness. He knew the city well enough to find quiet, isolated spots where he could dispose of evidence without being seen. His first stop was Warnemont Park, a lakeside area where he scattered parts of Sade's body. He chose different locations within the park, thinking this would make it harder for anyone to find all the evidence. After disposing of the body parts, Anderson drove Sade's car to a secluded area behind an abandoned building. He doused the Honda Civic with gasoline and set it on fire. The flames consumed the interior, destroying what Anderson hoped would be crucial DNA evidence and fingerprints that could link him to Sade's disappearance. But here's what shows just how cold Anderson really was. After watching Sade's car burn, he calmly walked to a nearby bus stop. Security cameras captured him boarding public transportation like he was just another commuter heading to work. He rode the bus back to his apartment and went about his day as if nothing had happened. Anderson's next move was perhaps his most calculated. He began sending text messages from Sade's phone to make it look like she was still alive. These messages were sent to her friends and family, designed to buy Anderson time before anyone realized something was wrong. The texts made it seem like Sade had left his apartment safely and was going about her normal routine. But Anderson wasn't as smart as he thought he was. The fake messages had problems that investigators would quickly notice. The timing was wrong. The language didn't sound like Sade, and the circumstances didn't make sense. Anyone who knew Sade well could tell these messages weren't really from her. Meanwhile, Sade's family was starting to worry. When she didn't come home and stopped responding to calls and texts in her usual way, they knew something was seriously wrong. Sade was the type of person who stayed in regular contact with her loved ones. Her sudden silence was completely out of character. The discovery of what happened to Sade began when someone found her burned-out Honda Civic. The car was reported to police, who quickly identified it as belonging to a missing person. This was the first real clue that something terrible had happened to Sade Robinson. Then came the horrific discoveries that shocked the entire Milwaukee community. Over the next several days, people walking through Warnemont Park began finding human remains. The first discovery was made by someone who was just out for a walk and noticed something that didn't belong. They immediately called police. As investigators searched the area more thoroughly, they found more body parts scattered throughout the park. Each discovery was more devastating than the last. The Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office worked to identify the remains, and the worst fears of Sade's family were confirmed. The news of Sade's murder sent shockwaves through Milwaukee. Here was a 19-year-old college student who had simply gone on what she thought was a normal date, only to become the victim of an unimaginably brutal crime. The community was horrified that something so violent could happen to someone so young and innocent. For Sade's family, the discovery of her remains was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for months. Not only had they lost their daughter, sister, and friend, but they had to live with the knowledge of how she died. The fake text messages Anderson had sent made the whole situation even more cruel. He had given them false hope, while knowing exactly what he had done to their loved one. The Milwaukee Police Department moved quickly once they realized Sade Robinson was missing. Her family had reported her disappearance, and when investigators found her burned-out Honda Civic, they knew they were dealing with something much more serious than a simple missing person case. The fake text messages from Sade's phone were actually Anderson's biggest mistake. When detectives analyzed the messages, they could tell immediately that someone else was using her phone. The language was wrong, the timing didn't make sense, and the messages stopped coming at exactly the wrong moment. This led investigators to look closely at the last person Sade had been seen with. Security footage from the Twisted Fisherman and Dukes on Water showed Sade with Maxwell Anderson on the night she disappeared. Cell phone records confirmed that both of their phones had been at Anderson's apartment that evening. When investigators ran Anderson's name through their system, they discovered he had a criminal history that made him an even more serious suspect. The evidence against Anderson kept piling up. Digital forensics experts found the disturbing photos on his phone, showing him groping Sade while she was unconscious on his couch. These photos were taken on the night she disappeared, proving that Anderson had been alone with her when she was incapacitated. When police obtained a search warrant for Anderson's apartment at 3161 South 39th Street, what they found was horrifying. The basement had been set up like a torture chamber, with tarps spread across the floor and saws that had clearly been used recently. Blood evidence was found throughout the apartment, particularly in the basement area. Investigators also found cleaning supplies and bleach that Anderson had used to try to scrub away evidence. But forensic technology is advanced enough that traces of blood can still be detected, even after someone tries to clean it up. The evidence clearly showed that someone had been killed and dismembered in that apartment. Anderson was arrested on April 4th, just 3 days after Sade's murder. When police came to his door, he acted surprised and claimed he had no idea what had happened to Sade. He told investigators that she had left his apartment safely after their date and that he hadn't seen her since, but Anderson's story fell apart immediately. The evidence was overwhelming. The photos on his phone, the blood in his apartment, the fake text messages, the security footage, and the cell phone records all pointed directly to him. There was no other explanation for what had happened to Sade Robinson. During his initial questioning, Anderson continued to deny any involvement in Sade's death. He claimed the photos on his phone had been taken with her consent and that she had been fine when she left his apartment. He suggested that someone else must have killed her after she left his place. The problem with Anderson's story was that investigators had already traced every minute of that night through digital evidence and security cameras. They knew exactly when Sade had arrived at his apartment, and they knew she had never left alive. Anderson's lies only made him look more guilty, and prosecutors knew they had a strong case against him. Maxwell Anderson's trial began in July 2024, just 3 months after Sade Robinson's murder. The Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office was determined to get justice for Sade and her family, and they had built what they believed was an airtight case against Anderson. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the jury with a timeline that showed exactly what had happened on the night of April 1st and the early morning hours of April 2nd. Security footage from the restaurants and bars showed Sade and Anderson together, appearing to have a normal evening out. Cell phone records proved that both of their phones were at Anderson's apartment that night. But the most damaging evidence came from Anderson's own phone. The photos showing him groping Sade while she was unconscious on his couch were shown to the jury. Prosecutors argued that these photos proved Anderson had incapacitated Sade and was documenting his assault on her. The images were so disturbing that some jury members visibly reacted when they were presented in court. The prosecution also presented evidence from the search of Anderson's apartment. Crime scene investigators testified about finding blood throughout the residence, particularly in the basement area. They described finding tarps, saws, and other tools that had been used to dismember Sade's body. The basement was described by prosecutors as being specifically set up for torture and murder. Digital forensics experts explained how they had traced the fake text messages sent from Sade's phone after her death. They showed the jury exactly when these messages were sent and how they could tell that Anderson, not Sade, had been using her phone. This evidence proved that Anderson had tried to cover up his crime by making it look like Sade was still alive. Medical examiners testified about the condition of Sade's remains when they were found scattered throughout Warnemont Park. While they couldn't determine the exact cause of death due to the condition of the body, they confirmed that Sade had been dismembered after death using tools consistent with what was found in Anderson's apartment. Throughout the trial, Anderson maintained his innocence. His defense team argued that the prosecution hadn't proven exactly how Sade died or what Anderson's motive was for killing her. They suggested that the evidence was circumstantial and that someone else could have been responsible for Sade's death. But the jury wasn't buying Anderson's claims of innocence. The evidence was too overwhelming, and Anderson's behavior after Sade's disappearance was too suspicious. His attempts to cover up the crime by sending fake text messages and burning her car showed consciousness of guilt that the jury couldn't ignore. The trial lasted several weeks, with emotional testimony from Sade's family and friends about the impact her death had on their lives. They described a young woman who was full of life, working hard in school and looking forward to her future. The contrast between who Sade was and what Anderson had done to her was heartbreaking. The courtroom was packed on August 1, 2025, the day of Maxwell Anderson's sentencing. After being found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and arson, everyone waited to hear what punishment he would face. Milwaukee County Circuit Judge Laura Crivello had already made it clear this was one of the most disturbing cases she had ever seen. Sade's parents, Sheena Scarborough and Carlos Robinson, had waited over a year for this moment. They sat in the front row, holding hands tightly as they prepared to face their daughter's killer one last time. The pain in their eyes was clear to everyone in the courtroom. When it came time for victim impact statements, the raw emotion was overwhelming. Sade's mother, Sheena, spoke first, her voice filled with anger and grief. She called Anderson a demon and told the court that he had messed the entire community up. Her words carried the weight of a mother's unbearable loss and the fury of knowing what Anderson had done to her daughter. Sheena talked about how the family could never be the same. She described the empty space Sade's death had left in their lives and how they struggled every day with the knowledge of what had happened to their beloved daughter. "You took away my baby girl," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Sade's father, Carlos, also spoke, and his words were filled with raw pain and anger. "Everything that he did should be done to him," he told the court. "No man should be able to live after what he did. That's just how I feel. I can't get past this. I can't." His statement showed the depth of a father's anguish and his struggle to find any way to cope with such an unimaginable loss. Both parents talked about something that made their pain even worse. They still didn't know where Sade's head was. Anderson had never told police what he did with this part of their daughter's remains. This meant they couldn't give Sade a complete burial, and the family continued to suffer knowing that part of their daughter was still missing. The parents called for the harshest possible punishment. They wanted Anderson to spend the rest of his life in prison, never to be free again. They felt that anything less would be an insult to Sade's memory and would not serve justice for the horrible crimes he had committed. When the judge spoke, her words were harsh and direct. She called Anderson's crimes unconscionable and said his view of reality differs from the rest of the world. The judge noted that Anderson had shown no remorse throughout the entire process and had repeatedly contradicted the overwhelming evidence against him. The judge described the case as beyond imaginable, comparing it to something out of a horror novel. She talked about the unthinkable pain of parents not knowing whether their child was dead or alive, only to learn that their daughter had been dismembered and disgraced. The judge then announced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 7.5 years for mutilating a corpse and a 1.5 years for arson. This meant Anderson would never be free again. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he did to Sade. Even during his sentencing, Anderson maintained his innocence. He told the court he did not commit these crimes and planned to appeal his convictions. His complete lack of remorse and continued denial only added to the family's pain and anger. Sade Robinson was more than just a victim in a true crime story. She was a young woman with dreams, goals, and people who loved her deeply. Her family and friends remember her bright smile, her kindness, and the future she should have had. The pain her family feels will never fully go away. They've had to live with the knowledge that someone took their daughter, sister, and friend away from them in the most horrible way. Yet they've shown incredible strength in seeking justice and keeping Sade's memory alive. This case shows us that we all have a responsibility to create safer communities. Whether it's checking on a friend, reporting suspicious behavior, or simply listening when someone shares their concerns, we can all make a difference. Sade's story is a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. If her story helps even one person recognize danger signs or make safer choices, then something positive comes from this terrible loss. Remember Sade Robinson not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life mattered. Let her story inspire us to be more careful, more aware, and more protective of each other. If this video made you think about personal safety in a new way, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who might benefit from these important lessons.